We don't discuss it, we don't think it through. The simple, quick answer would be, let's pursue the death penalty.
And they're saying, for some reason, we want to avail that person's or avenge that person's death. And we can avenge it, but it's not going to do anything.
We haven't executed anybody since 1939. So it's a fact that the next person, if there is an execution, will be the first person in 80 years. That is arbitrary and capricious.
You know, it's just a mistake to think the science is going to save us from error, because we're human.
The death penalty is being touted as a tool that is going to aid and assist police officers, right? That's one of the arguments, is that you kill a police officer, we will kill you.
I've had lots of interaction with individuals who have been sentenced to very long periods of time, 25 to life, and life without parole. And I've never had any of them say to me that if I had known I could face the death penalty, I wouldn't have done it.
Nobody stops and says to somebody before they commit a murder, remember now, capital punishment is a factor that's in this state that you're going to be exposed to. They have to have that knowledge, and they have to draw upon that knowledge in the midst of a situation where they are so either angry, violent, desperate, whatever that the case might be, that's going to overshadow their emotions.
I don't imagine a criminal sitting back thinking, oh wait, I need to stop this, I may face a death penalty. I just don't think that's realistic. I mean, I think a lot of this is planned out or not. I think if someone's going to go ahead with it, they're thinking, I'm going to get away with it.
And so the whole premise of it is that an informed criminal population will make rational choices. If they were going to make rational choices, they wouldn't be committing the crime. They don't think they're going to be caught. I mean, that's reality. So why do we deny that? Why do we pretend like that's not true?
I understand where policymakers are coming from. They're seeing this as a stance of supporting the law enforcement professional who is out protecting society. And therefore, that's how I think it's being played or spun to the law enforcement community is, look, we're taking care of you should this occur. However, I think that's hollow, and I don't think that's a sound, civilized way of approaching this.
When you look at New Hampshire itself, if you believe that our death penalty in the state actually deters criminals, then you have to ignore what happened in Franconia, New Hampshire. You have to ignore what happened in Greenland, New Hampshire. You have to ignore what happened in Brentwood. In all my years of law enforcement, what I have learned is most criminals are impulsive. They don't sit there and weigh the options before they commit a crime.
Those that say that the death penalty increases the level of safety, I think frequently don't examine the information that's out there.
And of course, one of the things you could do is you could look at the homicide rate for all the states that did not have capital punishment and those that did. And it turned out there was a very clear pattern. The states that did not have capital punishment, without exception, had lower murder rates than the average of those states that did have capital punishment.
I believe years ago that maybe the death penalty deterred violent crime, that who would possibly commit a violent crime if death was a penalty. And then I realized that Texas has killed about 12 people a year in their death chambers for the last 40 years, and Texas has a pretty high crime rate.
So if deterrence isn't meaningful, for which there is no support other than opinion, then that, again, in my view, undermines the validity of it.
Because if the goal is to deter them, It's not working. Just go to Texas and find out.
I am not morally opposed to the death penalty, any more than I was a conscientious objector as a kid when I was in service. I'm not a conscientious objector. That doesn't mean I favor every war. And I'm not morally opposed to the death penalty. But the death penalty is unfairly applied, and I don't want to be a part of that.
If we as a society are going to speak up and say, hey, this is what we're going to stand tall for justice, and we're going to stand tall for this, then we have to really rethink and re-examine how we are dispensing that sense of justice.
Well, I've heard the phrase that we're very judicious with our death penalty in the state, and we save it for the worst of the worst. And I always found that a curious statement to make, because first of all, what that tells me is that the person making that statement hasn't read the statute.
My wife's was a high school principal. Is her life better or worse than mine? And you look at these folks around the country that lose their lives, that aren't policemen, that aren't law enforcement, but still have a value to society. Is their value any more than mine or any less?
To the person who has suffered the loss, every single murder is the worst of the worst. And the life of every single person is valuable. I believe that. I believe that. None of us are more valuable or less valuable than any other person. And so this hierarchy of value, I find offensive, and I know that murder victim family members find very, very painful.
It's a jury which, when asked questions in what's called the voir dire, is asked whether or not they have a moral opposition to the death penalty that would prevent them from voting for the death penalty. And if you indicate that you have an objection, conscientious objection to it, any objection, then you're not permitted on that jury. So everyone on the jury has to be able to vote for the death penalty. Of course, that disqualifies, I don't know how many percentage of people in New Hampshire, but a very large slice of people.
So when we do that, I think that we expose ourselves to a jury system that's very, very, very much imperfect.
There were two capital murder cases going on at the same time. There was Brooks and Addison. Addison was the fellow who murdered a police officer in Manchester. Brooks was a fellow who basically hired someone to murder someone who owed him just a little bit of money. Addison was a undereducated, poor black kid from Massachusetts, and Brooks was a wealthy homeowner and business owner. Two trials, both found guilty of capital murder, but during the penalty phase, the two juries came up with different points of view. Addison got death penalty, and Brooks got life without possibility of parole.
And you cannot make the argument that you're treating people similarly situated in similar ways. You're not. You're picking one person out of the haystack and saying, I appoint you as the person who's going to suffer this penalty. That is not the way that you can have a system that is respected by the broad base of the citizens in your state. And a criminal justice system has got to be respected by the broad base of citizens in the state.
if you look at the problem from a fiscal perspective, how much are we spending? We're spending a whole lot more to kill people than to imprison them for the rest of their life.
We have to talk about the other fact of effectiveness and costs. You know, how much money is it going to incur to terminate someone's life? They're going to get their attorneys, they're going to have all these appeals, they're going to drag this out. It's going to cost us millions and millions of dollars.
We are seeing here in New Hampshire, we're up to about 5 million. I've heard estimates, but by the time the federal appeals are done, we could be closer to $10 million spent on one case.
The money that's available, if we didn't have to pay for these endless appeals and lengthy prosecutions, would allow them to increase the manpower on the street, increase the level of training.
You could use it for, you know, rehab programs, any sort of social outreach. You could use it, hey, how about you give a cop a raise? How about you give them the equipment training they could use?
I would take that money that someone else might spend on the death penalty, $5 million, and I would make sure that the family that survived had that person's salary plus a grade or two up for the rest of their natural lives. And I would pay for the college education of each of those children in the best college that they could get into. It would cost a lot less than $5 million.
We ought to support them as much as we can financially and emotionally, and try and make their families as whole as possible. That's what we owe those police officers. And it means more than, hey, you got a conviction for someone, we're going to put someone to death for you.
This happened 12 years ago now. And it seems like whenever you start to get some sort of, I'll never use the words like get over it when people say it, because you don't. You know, it's your life changes and you do what you can to get along. But when you do start to get any sort of healing or a sense of, okay, things are getting better, there's a new hearing, there's a new, the issue's in the paper again. It just keeps coming back and back and back. Whereas if back in 08 at the trial, this had just been life without possibility of parole, and that's going to be put away and forgotten. I'm not saying you'd be completely healed like people involved in this would be, no. But there'd be some sense of, maybe I can start to patch things back together, or at least be left alone and not be thrown as in, tell me about this, what do you think about that? This issue just keeps coming back and back and back. And what that does, I can't imagine what it does to some families, but what it does to mine, I know, and it's not a good thing.
In a prior effort at the legislature, there was a very powerful testimony by a warden from Florida. And he said that when he first took over the job as a warden, he fully knew that he was going to be having to preside over and take part in executions. After several of those executions had occurred, he had trouble sleeping, he had trouble with substance abuse, and the most powerful thing was, he said, every night when he went to bed, there was a bunch of the men who were executed sitting in chairs next to his bed. I mean, it's a very potent psychological impact that invaded so many aspects of his life.
I wasn't the only one affected by these executions. In both Florida and Texas, I saw staff traumatized by the duties they were asked to perform. Officers who had never even met the inmate fought tears and cowered in corners so they wouldn't be seen and wouldn't be taken as a weakness. Many of my colleagues turned to drugs and alcohol, numbed the pain of knowing that a man had died at their hands.
People in the employ of the department whose primary jobs are safety and security and programming and health care and all of that, will all of a sudden have to be involved one way or another in the execution of someone inside the facility. And I think it's going to have dramatic and very troubling effects.
So life in prison without parole, to me, is actually the worser of the two penalties.
Some of those cells are really old, and I just can't imagine being in there for a length of time. Sometimes I hear the stories that people would rather be executed than stay in some of these cells.
If you go to prison when you're 22 and your family is still living, your parents are alive, and so for the first 10 or 15 years people visit you, and your story is still pretty topical. Then you hit year 25 and you're in your late 40s and your parents aren't well, they don't come anymore. And then your parents pass away and you're not going to their funeral. Then your sister moved away and she's not too proud of you to begin with. And then you're 60 years old and nobody knows your name and nobody cares about you anymore. And the world is moving past you, but you're still there for the whole trip. I can't imagine that, to be honest.
Throw away the key. Let him get in prison. That's fine. Let him never see the light of day. He doesn't deserve it. He really doesn't. I'm not asking for leniency. I'm just saying we don't need to kill.
To have to contemplate every single day for the course of, what, 40 years, 35, 40 years, that's got to be torture on the brain.
Part of being Catholic is a sense of redemption, that people do make mistakes and they are able to redeem themselves. Whether someone does or not, it's up to them. But I'm a believer in that if we kill someone, they don't have a chance to redeem themselves.
Everyone, even someone who has committed the most heinous of crimes, still has at the core some level of humanity that needs to be respected.
It's my choice to put you in a safe place, as it relates to the rest of us, for a violent or unconscionable crime, but it's not my place to decide when you die, only that you can't hurt others anymore.
It's really hard not to fall into the trap of making up your mind about what had happened before the evidence really presents itself. And then what happens is that you look for evidence that supports your theory and you disregard evidence that doesn't support your theory. So I went in there, looked at that scene, and you know, my first reaction was that, well, my client is probably guilty of this. When the police asked him about, you know, assaulting and murdering Elizabeth the night before, what he said was, well, I was really drunk that night, but it doesn't sound like anything I would do.
The police authentically believed what I believed, and that is that Buchanan was the murderer. So they pressed her on that. And I am all but 100% convinced that Ruth was her name, that she believed that if she did not tell the police what she perceived they wanted to hear, that they were going to take her other child. So, I think that's why she did what she did.
The police have, you know, a weak denial by Richard. They have evidence of no break-in as far as they're concerned. And now they have an eyewitness who says that they saw my client on top of Elizabeth and raping her and smothering her. So this seemed like a pretty hopeless case.
I remember then that there was a friend whom I thought very highly of, a very conservative Republican senator. But I liked him, he liked me. I think it was because we were probably both in the service, and he knew I had 2 sons who were Marines, and we just got along well. But he came into my office accompanied by a member of the House, and he was red-faced, and he was pounding on my desk. It wasn't threatening me, he was pounding, he was furious, as you can imagine. Demanded the death penalty for Richard Buchanan.
We had hired a DNA expert of our own, and I sent the report off to him, and I asked, well, what does this mean? Does it, what does this mean exactly? And he said to me, what it means, Barbara, is that your client is not guilty. And I was stunned. I was just stunned. I couldn't believe it. What I know is that if the true assailant, who is James Dale, if he had worn a condom that night, I don't think there's any doubt that a jury would not have found Mr. Buchanan guilty of capital murder, and the crime was so outrageous, I think it's highly likely that he would have been given the death penalty.
That to me says, whoa, we need to stop and slow down here. We need to think, what is going on?
Anytime that we take any action that's irreversible, the chance for an error is always going to be there.
Some people who we would have executed, thanks to the beauty of DNA, are now walking around. Eyewitness testimony is not perfect, we know that. We've executed innocent people.
I kept a photo of Elizabeth Knapp on my bookshelf, right next to the door that I would go in and out of my office in. I really never discussed that until after I was AG, but a lot of people thought it was there for a sentimental reason or whatever. It was there to remind me, given the authority of an Attorney General, it was there to remind me every time I left that office that I believed something absolutely, and I was wrong.
The one thing I learned as a judge in those 15 years on the court is I was not infallible, and the system over which I was presiding was not infallible. And so therefore, it takes a fair amount of hubris to say, we are so certain that this person's life should be taken. I would not be that certain.
I wouldn't want the last thing that was related to my legacy to be the death of another person. I wouldn't want that.
You know, as a politician, your legacy is your vote. And do you want to say, hey, I voted for this or against it? It's going to count. Which side do you really want to be on? Not when the votes are happening 20, 30 years down the road. What side do you want to be remembered as being on?
There is nothing that those policemen can do to avoid the danger of that job. Nothing. 911, they're going to go. And when they go, some of them are going to be hurt, and some of them will be killed. And that is why the people of this state respect those police. And I'll tell you, if I were a young policeman, what I would feel pretty good about is the fact that if anything happens to me doing my job, that I'm going to get covered and they're going to take care of my family the way I wish I could take care of my family. That, to me, that's what good governance is about.
I just think as a civilized society, we ought to be leading the world, not following. And all of our New England states and all of our industrialized nations living fully in the 21st century have said, we're not doing that. But Iran's doing it, Saudi Arabia's doing it. I don't want to be in that neighborhood. Not who we are as a people. And it's not like if we don't take your life, you didn't get punished. In many ways, you were punished more severely.